So I've spent my time going around different places. The reason I'm here, I suppose, is that I went to a school where there was no motivation. I went to a school where the most interesting thing you could do was not be at school. Where actually, that great Ken Robinson story about sitting in a classroom and watching a guy come along mowing the grass and thinking, I'd really like to be the man mowing the grass, because mowing the grass is more interesting than sitting here. That was my experience of secondary school. It was an absolute disaster. The secondary school that I went to was like a barely contained open prison with a really demoralized staff trying to keep control of 1,500 boys, where I learned nothing other than how to use my pocket money to buy cigarettes so I could smoke at lunchtime. I literally learned nothing. And then 2 years later, I got a scholarship to Oxford. And it just seemed amazing to me that you could go through a school where there was no interest at all in motivating you or connecting with you or finding your talent. And then 2 years later, almost by chance, someone does. And that actually our education systems are full of people who want their talents to be found, explored, developed, and actually nothing is happening. If you think of our education systems not as social sorting systems, dispatching people like a carousel at a UPS depot to their destinations, but think of education as a talent development and spotting system, then our education systems are disasters. They're absolutely dreadful. So that's one reason why I'm here. But the second reason is that a few years ago, I grew slightly tired of hearing myself and hearing other people talk about the amazing example of the Finnish or the Singaporean or the Ontarian or the Victorian education system, and the implicit argument being that if we could just capture what was brilliant about Finland and then distill it for the rest of the world, then everything would be fine. And so I went round the world looking at examples of people who were trying to provide interesting, engaging, successful forms of learning without any of those resources. And so I think it's absolutely vital that whatever agenda we have, it's not just an agenda of trying to learn from what appears to be the very best and then spreading it around the world, but finding solutions that work in the places where they have to work and for the people that they're working for. And so if you think about the future, as we're invited to at this conference, there are lots and lots of ways not to think about the future. One of the things I have to admit I really hate is the idea of 21st century skills. Imagine that this was a century ago and we were tasked at this conference with coming up with 20th century skills. And the car would just about have become more than a niche product. There would have been no sense of the mass rise of antibiotics or of X-rays. The pill would have been a distant idea. Nazism wouldn't have emerged yet. Communism was just on the horizon. All the independence movements and the decolonization of the late 20th century, unimaginable. What would we have decided would be the curriculum for the 20th century were we doing it? So there's a real danger of over-specifying what we need to learn based on what we currently think about the future. Be wary of being too precise and prescriptive. So if we think about the kind of world that young people will face, and we think about the kinds of organizations and capabilities that would be well suited to that world, and then we think about what kind of learning and schools would produce those kinds of capabilities, where would we start? Well, I would start with some very, very general features of the world. And the first is this, that we live in a world of tightening constraints. In the developed world, it's a world of tightening fiscal constraints, but it's also a world where aging will take more resources from society. In the developing world, the constraints are material, not just for the state, but also for consumers and families who live on very low incomes, even if they're getting richer. And of course, climate change and resource demands are going to impose even more constraints. So the fact is that we live in a world of tightening constraints, where resources in particular, and particularly very basic things like water, are going to be absolutely critical to the way people live in future. But it's also a world of rising aspirations and expectations of how people want to live. All around the world, especially amongst young people, there's a growing culture of a desire for self-realization, self-expression, for people to become the authors of their lives, for their lives not to be determined by where they're born. So if you go to India, the big revolution that's sweeping through India is that where you are born doesn't determine necessarily who you will be. That is an enormous change. And that change is happening all around the world. So in a world of tightening constraints, we have also rising aspirations. That is a recipe for frustration. What do we have to address that rising frustration? Well, the biggest thing that we have going in our favour are limitless opportunities for collaboration, largely born by new technologies which allow ourselves to organise ourselves in new ways. The cornucopia that we have is that if you look at the amazing supercomputers of the year 2000 that were able to do incredible feats of computation, to play chess games and to quantify and calculate enormous calculations, those computers, which were roughly speaking the size of a tennis court, are now the size of a PS3. So that phenomena, this abundance of our ability to compute, connect, and through software and hardware, create new forms of organization and collaboration is absolutely essential. The downside of that is that all of that new form of collaboration breeds endemic uncertainty, and what it really breeds is a challenge to established models of organization, education included. And that means that if you're working in any kind of organizational field touched by these forces, you're likely to be caught in a kind of civil war. So the organizations that I advise are by and large companies and often public sector organizations, and they're by and large caught in a kind of civil war between people who say, yeah, we know that this way of doing things is tired and exhausted and hierarchical and slow-moving and out of touch, but it's what we do, and we know how to do it. And over here, people saying, no, the future looks like this. It's networked, collaborative, creative, participative, but we've no idea how to do it at scale. And many institutions are caught in this kind of tension about where their future lies, the uncertainty of creating new ways of doing things which require entrepreneurship, innovation, and leaps of faith, and a kind of certainty which nevertheless leads to a kind of dead end. So the young people who we are trying to help to shape the future will have to be comfortable with a world of endemic uncertainty in which they'll have to act without knowing the outcome in advance. And the product of that is a world of kind of oxymorons, of constant strange combinations, of a kind of policy framework often in governments which is a kind of centralized decentralization, or within companies a kind of hierarchical collaboration, where you get mixtures of things which shouldn't really go together. Or let me give you one other example which might connect with the way that you feel you live. It's a kind of life of a kind of frenzied stagnation, where everything is urgent and you never get away from work because you're always connected through email, through social media, through bleeps, alerts, your electronic diary filling up automatically with meetings. So everything is rushed and busy and urgent, and yet nothing ever seems to change. And that sense that life is in a kind of whirlpool of rapid change but deep stagnation is, I think, going to be a condition of our times, because the forces of stagnation in our society are very, very powerful. Forces of stagnation from incumbents, from the fact that we're aging, from the fact that in Europe certainly growth is going to be very slow, and on the other hand, waves of technology which bring change, uncertainty, innovation, disruption, so on and so forth. So one of the features of the world that young people will have to cope with is this strange sense that it's both difficult to change and stuck, and yet deeply fluid and very, very open.